big idea in Profaning Paul is asking the question, this guy Paul, who's written a big chunk of the New Testament, who is known as sort of one of the key theological voices in Christian history, why is it that this guy who says a lot of pretty nasty stuff in his letters, why is it that he is always the hero in biblical studies? Why is it that people spend so much time trying to make Paul, who says some pretty bad things, into a good guy? And it's not that I want to say that Paul's a bad guy or a good guy. What I'm really interested in is, why do biblical scholars, and even people who aren't biblical scholars, even people who aren't Christians, why do they think that Paul has to be the hero of every story that we tell about him? There are several parts of Paul's letters where Paul says things about slavery. And in all of Paul's letters, you can find this in 1 Corinthians, you can find this in Ephesians and Colossians, and in the pastoral epistles. You can see this even in other minor spots in Paul's letters where Paul talks about how being in Christ, say, means that there's neither slave nor free anymore. But when Paul talks about slavery, one of the things that you notice if you pay enough attention is that he never says that slavery is bad. And I want to press upon that in the book a little bit, because Paul's letters have been used for all sorts of nefarious purposes when it comes to people who are enslaved throughout the last several thousand years. Paul's letters have been used to justify slavery systems from antiquity to early modernity, to justify slavery in the American South, for example. And there's been a lot of work that's been done by biblical scholars to try to take the burden of that guilt off of Paul, the guilt for the endorsement of the slave system. And one of the ways they do that is to note that some of the places where Paul's letters really seem to overtly support slavery are letters that modern biblical scholars think were not written by Paul. That's like Ephesians and Colossians and the pastorals. And so the idea there is that, well, Paul's letters, the ones that really endorse slavery weren't written by Paul, so he's not really responsible for that. But I want to press a little bit more on that, because when Paul doesn't ever do this thing where he says that slavery is bad, that enslaving other human beings is a terrible, horrible thing. And the thing is that I kind of want my heroes to say that slavery is bad. Now, I don't think that Paul is responsible for the enslavement of African Americans. I don't think Paul is responsible for ancient slavery. But what I do worry about is Paul retaining a place as a kind of canonical central voice in modern culture, in even academic biblical studies, when we don't challenge the fact that this was someone who saw people be enslaved, saw that it was a useful system, used it for his own ends, whatever we think about those ends, and didn't speak up about it. Biblical scholars have done a lot of work, spent a lot of energy trying to find little ways in which Paul was nice to slaves, treated slaves well, maybe created some ways of thinking that might have opened up the space for people to think that freeing slaves or ending the enslavement of their fellow humans would be a good thing. But at the end of the day, Paul doesn't take a firm stance on something that I view to be a major human rights issue. And that gets at a bigger problem with Paul's letters, is that Paul does and says a lot of things that really don't mark him as, say, liberal or progressive or multicultural, and a lot of the things that academic biblical scholars and people who read Paul's letters today kind of want or need him to be. And what I find when we get to that, dig down into that, is that there's something about Paul as a biblical writer, as someone whose writings are in the canon of the New Testament, in the Christian canon, that means that his writings are always already able to be recycled and redeemed. And that there's a work of redeeming Paul that is done without people really thinking about it, without even really questioning whether that's a good idea or not. And so Paul's letters are made to say things that don't really sound like what's on the page, all in the service of making sure that no one says, well, maybe we shouldn't read these texts anymore. Maybe we shouldn't let them be central to our culture, to our politics, to our theology. And what the book is trying to press on is maybe there's a different way of approaching Paul's letters. Maybe if we take them out of being part of the canon, if we kind of abstract them from the process by which Paul is always already redeemed for our use, then maybe we find different ways of engaging with them that don't always center on Paul and don't always make Paul the hero. And in this, the book draws a lot on feminist, queer, and womanist, and even enslaved readings of Paul's letters. I look at enslaved African Americans who tell stories about their engagement with Paul's letters in the antebellum South. I look at feminist and queer and womanist biblical scholars who, for decades now, have been pushing and pushing and pushing to get people to question the assumptions that they have around how to read and interpret Paul's letters, often to very little or no avail. And the hope with the book is to get people to rethink, what does it mean to engage with these texts? What does it mean to read them in a way that doesn't make Paul the hero? And what possible political and theological outcomes might emerge from that?